Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we are going to hear about the sexuality papers, male sexuality and the social control of women. And we were hoping to have Elizabeth Miller and Angela Wild, but Elizabeth is not managing to get onto the webinar because of a lot of cold where she's living, lots of snow, so possibly won't be here. But we are very lucky to have Sheila Jeffries, who's one of the authors of the sexuality papers, who's going to introduce the papers and also do some of the content that Elizabeth was going to do. So welcome, Angela and Sheila, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Joe. So Angela's going to take the whole of the second half, and what I'm going to do, I was just going to do a little introduction to where the book came from, but because Liz can't get here, I'm going to go through the slides that she'd created to talk about the introduction and the chapter that I have in the book. And I have to say, I haven't looked at this book for a very, very, very long time. So I'm having to sort of leap in. And so it could be a bit strange in the way that it comes across. And I'm sorry about that, but I'll do my best. And Angela will be great when she gets here. Okay. So I thought I'd start off just by explaining where the book came from. In the late 1970s, 78, 79, I was doing a PhD, a history PhD, and in 1978, a group of women, of whom I was one, got together and we set up a group called the Patriarchy Study Group. And most of the women were doing PhDs. It was sort of the beginning of feminist research and women's studies. So it was all quite exciting. And there were a couple of women in the group who were doing MAs and so on. But basically, it was students doing research, doing feminist research, and radical feminists, in fact. And we wanted, or revolutionary feminists, as I called myself, and many of us did at the time. And we wanted to be able to talk about feminist theory. And so what we set up was a system whereby every 6 weeks, we would go to where one of us lived. It started off with probably about 8 to 10 women, and we'd take our sleeping bags and we'd all stay on the floor for a weekend. And we'd have a whole weekend of talking about feminist theory. Somebody might introduce what they were interested in. And of course, at the time, we had to talk about things like the fact that Foucault was being seen as the answer to everything. 1978, Michel Foucault was being adopted by the sort of the feminists, the socialist feminists doing those who were doing research. The socialist feminists decided that Foucault was the way to go. He was the answer. This gay man who didn't mention women and was a sadomasochist was the answer to everything and would enable feminist research and make it all possible. We obviously reacted completely against that. So really the Patriarchy Study Group was in opposition. And I can remember that one of the things that we did at the beginning was that we thought of all the men's ridiculous theories and ways of looking at things, including Foucault and others, and we used each theory to try and explain. And the example we took was indecent exposure, because that is really in his book, The History of Sexuality, Volume 1. That is the only mention that Foucault ever makes of women. There's a little anecdote he has of a little girl who experienced indecent exposure. In other words, a man engaging in aggressive dominance behavior by showing his penis for sexual excitement, to a little girl. And Foucault's approach to this was, well, she was only upset because it was just like spiders. It was something she'd been led to or expected to be upset about. Little girls shouldn't mind men shoving their penises in their faces at all. That's a perfectly reasonable thing to do. Now, it's the only time he mentioned anything to do with women in the book. So we thought we'd take the example of indecent exposure and then apply to it all the different men's theories about how the world worked, symbolic interactionism and this and that and the other. And each of us took one of these men's theories and applied it to indecent exposure to show how, well, we had a laugh actually. We fell about laughing with symbolic interactionism and so on, how they would try to explain what had only a feminist explanation of male sexual aggression. So that's kind of how we started, I think. And then we had this splendid time of meeting for a whole fortnight every 6 weeks. And that really is a whole weekend rather, every 6 weeks. And that really is a good amount of time to speak feminist theory and develop feminist theory. But what happened was, a while into this, we'd been going some time, and the book group was getting bigger and bigger and apparently doing very well. But one woman in the group decided that we were talking too much about sexuality, and we shouldn't be concentrating on sexuality. There were all sorts of other things. And I remember when she first brought this up, that we were looking too much at sexuality. I was probably guilty to some extent, because I was at that time, when I was doing my PhD on child sexual abuse of children, which turned into looking at the history of feminist campaigns against sexual abuse of children. I was much exercised on male sexuality. I thought it was absolutely crucial in the oppression of women, and we needed to look at it. But this woman who thought that we shouldn't look at it said we shouldn't look at sexuality directly. She said we could look at it sort of aslant and from a different angle. And she said perhaps what we should be looking at is the way in which tribesmen in some tribe in Papua New Guinea attached papier-mâché penises to their penises to make them very long, and then had little sort of competitions with these papier-mâché penises. That was an oblique way of looking at sexuality, which was much more interesting than actually looking at what men did sexually to children and women in Britain. So we should look sort of from a different perspective. What happened was that she split the group. I didn't realize, but one weekend I arrived for the weekend of one of our occasions, and found that half of the women, or quite a lot of them, had all been phoned up by this woman to take a position against me and others like me, because there were others, obviously, revolutionary feminists in there who wanted to talk about sexuality, and to say that we were wrong, and the group split. That pretty much ended then, except that all the women who wrote the sexuality papers, we'd been going about 2 years, I think, all the women who wrote the sexuality papers went on to work on the issue of sexuality. We all thought it was crucial. And the book, the Sexuality Papers, came out of that work that we all did. So we didn't let go of the idea, despite being a little bit bullied about it, that sexuality was crucial. Of course, what I've done in my life is write about sexuality pretty much ever since, including penile imperialism from 2 years ago. So I have actually sort of focused upon that. But it's interesting that it split what was a very important group around that issue. So let's look at, I'm going to look at Liz's slides here. So they're not mine. Anyway, first of all, she's telling us what's in the book. There's the introduction, which she says a bit more about. And then there's my chapter, Free from All Uninvited Touch of Man, Women's Campaigns Around Sexuality, 1880 to 1914. And that became my first book, Spinster and Her Enemies, because I was already working on that. And this quote is from Elizabeth Wolstenholme-Elmy, and I love the quote, that women should be able to live free from all uninvited touch of man, because it covers such a lot, sexual harassment, rape, and so on. It's a wonderful quote, and that's from the sort of 1890s. And then the second chapter is on sexuality and social construction, so sexology rather, and the social construction of male sexuality, looking at Havelock Ellis in particular by Margaret Jackson, And then she wrote her book later on, Sexology, called really looking at the feminists who wrote about sex at that time and criticizing the sexologists, called The Real Facts of Life. She went on to do that. And then chapter 3, also by Margaret Jackson, on sexology and the universalization of male sexuality. Then chapter 4, theory into practice, sexual liberation or social control, looking at Forum magazine. And obviously, Angela will go on to talk about that. But Forum magazine was the big sex sort of education magazine that everybody was supposed to be reading at the time, part porn, part sex education. Could I have the next slide, please, Jo? Yeah, and the next slide. So this is just saying what the book's about. It's the overall theme is feminist struggle regarding sexuality and the male backlash against it. And the papers show how sexology and the ideology of sexual liberation have been used to subvert the critique of male sexuality developed by women in the first wave of feminism, and how the sexologist's prescriptions for male and female sexuality have become the common currency of the contemporary sexual revolution. So in other words, how those sexologists created the sexuality of female subordination and male domination, and it became the template of the sexual revolution, and indeed defeated the feminists of the time. Next slide, please, Jo. So yes, it's just saying that the introduction is looking at how feminists fought through the 20th century against male sexual abuse of women and the backlash against that, which society called sexual liberation and the sexual revolution. And then there's my chapter about the first wave of feminism and the campaign by feminists to transform male sexual behavior by campaigning against the abuse of women in prostitution, sexual abuse of children, and marital rape. And the next chapter, Jo. And so this is just still looking at how the book's organized. 2 and 3, Margaret's discussing the role of sexology. I think we know about that one. Chapter 2, how Henry Havelock Ellis undermined the feminist challenge to male sexuality and supremacy, legitimated male sexual domination, and conscripted women into heterosexuality by prescribing that women should accept subordination to men and be rewarded for doing so by orgasms that their male partners should deliver. And I think what he said was women's body should be the violin and male hand should be the bow, or something absurd like that. So women should lie about and men should do things. Chapter 3 focuses on the second wave of sexology, where Kinsey and Havelock Ellis taught that penis in vagina sex is a biological imperative, and legitimated male violence against women by normalizing sexual practices based on dominance and submission. Next slide. The chapter 4, the authors discuss the relationship between women's liberation and so-called sexual liberation movement, looking at Forum magazine. And Forum magazine, of course, popularized Masters and Johnson and all the male constructed ideas about how dominance, submission, sex should operate that were called sexual liberation at that time. It was very, very strong propaganda. Women were told what they should enjoy, like Alex Comfort at the time said, women who didn't want to swallow their male partner's semen when they were having to suck the penises of these men should re-educate themselves and realize that actually semen was delightful and smelt like new mown hay. So there were all these sort of really strong messages about how women had to re-educate themselves in order to do the things that men were absolutely determined they had to do, all the servicing things that they had to do. Let's have the next slide, please. So also about the introduction. The introduction gives an overview of some of the themes that go throughout all the chapters. One theme, of course, was male sexuality as social control of women, which I have written about in penile imperialism, of course, still using the same terminology as we used at that time. And what we meant by that was that the way in which men exercised their sexuality constructed and controlled women's lives. So women had to be very careful, for instance, where they would go in the street, at what time of the day they would go anywhere, what areas of the city they should go to, because men would sexually harass them, potentially rape them, and potentially endanger their lives. So a sort of map of male sexuality constructed where women may go, how they may walk, and so on, which is, of course, still the case. And I seem to remember that we did in the intro talk about how male sexuality constructed what work women can do. For instance, we were talked about how it was difficult for women to be taxi drivers because they were alone in taxis and men could attack them in their taxis. It was hard for women to be social workers who might have to visit men's homes because they could be attacked. There was all kinds of work that was restricted in the way women could do it because of male sexuality and male sexual violence. So we were looking at all of those ways out of the home in which fear of male sexuality and the reality of male sexuality controlled women. And of course, one of those ways today is that women are being put again on a urinary leash. We're not able to use women's toilets because men have decided to take over that for their sexual excitement. So there's even more restrictions being put on women's lives now. Once upon a time, women could at least escape to the women's toilets from the way in which men were controlling all other areas of their lives. So that's what we meant by male sexuality as social control. And then in the introduction, we talk about the characteristics of normal male sexuality, such as power, aggression, penis orientation, separation of love, sex from loving emotion, from loving emotion, objectification, fetishism, uncontrollability. And I think it was a new thing we were doing, and I have to say it hasn't been done much since, which was actually describing male sexuality, doing a feminist analysis of male sexuality. It didn't exist. There was sexology, in which all these men gave those ideas about how wonderful male sexuality was and how women should service it. There was no critique. And I have to say there's been extremely little since. Although I've carried on trying to do this critique, it's still seen as nature somehow. Women are still supposed to service it, do the sex they don't want to do when the men want them to do it, not make any complaint, and so on. Yes, social control of women versus male sexuality. Liz is just talking about all of that again, on the street, in the home, at work, social life. How male acquire their sexuality through social construction, not biological determinism. We were absolutely clear that male sexuality was constructed from their position as the ruling class. So their sexuality is a ruling class sexuality, which requires a subordinate class on whom to act out. And of course, they act out on the subordinate class of women in pornography, prostitution, coerced sex, sexual harassment, and so on and so on. Let's have the next slide. Okay, so this is my chapter, chapter 1, free from all uninvited touch of man. So I argue that in 1880 to 1914, there was a huge campaign by women to transform male behavior and protect women and children and the effects of the damaging forms of male sexuality. And it was a massive, massive campaign. Women were criticizing male sexuality then. They said it absolutely didn't have to be the way that it was, meaning it were prostitution, child sexual abuse. So those were their particular concerns. And I talk about the 1880 social purity movement by feminists and other women. It's an attempt to repeal there was an attempt at, they were attempting to repeal something called the Contagious Diseases Act of the 1860s that allowed the compulsory examination of women suspected of working as prostitutes. And feminists pointed out that all of this infringed women's civil rights. They certainly did. And there was one organization, one woman who gave out little sort of pledge cards to men, the White Ribbon Campaign, and women had to, and the men had to come up to the front of these meetings. The meetings were being addressed by women who were saying, you've got to change your sexuality. You have to change your sexuality. Can you imagine that now? Can you imagine? And men had to come up and take the pledge cards and pledge that they would actually be chaste and actually not use women in prostitution and so on. A kind of extraordinary idea. They weren't tremendously feminist in the sense in which we would understand it probably, but they were very determined that men had to change. They wanted to end prostitution, which they saw as male abuse of women. Liz suggests here it was a three-pronged plan. Yes, ladies' associations, establish homes for homeless girls to train for domestic work and keep them out of prostitution. They were all over the country. We may see this as very classist from our point of view now, that poor girls were going to be trained for domestic work. But the fact is, the vast majority of women who were employed were in domestic work at the time. That was pretty much the only work that women were actually able to do. And the idea was if they were trained and then put into the houses of richer women, that would keep them out of prostitution. There were also societies at the time, because remember the railways were very, very important. They've been going for quite a long time. So they had, for instance, campaigners, volunteers who would go and meet young women off trains, because young women would be coming in from the countryside to find work in the city. There was a huge emptying out of the countryside as people came into work in the city. Young girls would come into work in the city, and they would immediately be met by pimps who would induct them into prostitution as soon as they got off the train. Oh, hello, dear. Do you have anywhere to stay for the night? Let me help you, all of that sort of thing. So there were actually feminists out there on the platforms, meeting the girls, taking them straight to one of these homes to try and keep them out of prostitution. This was hugely organized. The campaign by feminists against prostitution at this time was huge. And there were vigilant societies, yes, to encourage the prosecution of sex offenders and so on. And men's chastity leagues, that's what they're talking about, like with the white ribbon cards and so on. And the associations campaigned to raise the age of consent for girls and criminalize and prosecute the sexual abuse of children, rape, indecent exposure, street sexual harassment, and incest. And there are also campaigns for women doctors. So let me just explain. This is the period just immediately before the First World War. And one of the things that was happening, it was a massive feminist media at the time, lots and lots of magazines. There's nothing like it now, but there was in the 70s again, of course. And there was a column in one of the magazines, which was called Comparison of Punishments. And in that column, the writer compared the punishment for stealing a loaf of bread by somebody who was perhaps, poor and desperate to actually eat, and they would get a severe punishment. Whereas if a man sexually used his 7-year-old daughter, for instance, there was no punishment for it until 1908. The feminists worked to get a punishment of incest act, inadequate though it was. But in fact, magistrates would say things like, we can understand why you did this. She was very sort of alluring. We can understand why you did it. The feminists were absolutely furious that these men would get off and the poor and starving would actually be severely punished. But the other problem at this time was that there was no women's police force. It was almost impossible to prosecute these men for what they did to young girls because the young girls wouldn't survive in the courtrooms. They'd come into the courtrooms and they would be, as the feminists at the time described it, laughed at and taunted by rough village boys. I think that was the precise language. So yes, it would be entertainment that the boys would go in and shout and taunt any girls or indeed women who tried to do anything about sexual abuse. So it was completely impossible to do that. And the feminists argued there should be a women's police force and there should be women in all the courtrooms who could have these little girls on their laps so that they could give them support and look after them and make it possible for them to speak. So yes, indeed, they were campaigning for women police and women police were set up. Those setting it up were actually, when you look at the photographs and read about them, were very clearly lesbians at this time, which was quite interesting. And they wanted women doctors and women magistrates so that it was possible to do anything about men's violence against women. So that's where women's police came from originally. And I think that's probably, let's look, I think there's that the next chapter that is going on to, oh, no, there's more. However, I don't think I need to say any more about that chapter. I think what we need to do, because it is the right time, is go on to Angela to talk about this book. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Sheila, so much for stepping in. So I had Liz on the phone and she on the text, and she really apologizes for not being there. But thank you, Sheila, so much for stepping in. I hope you can all hear me. So my part of the presentation today focuses on the remaining 3 chapters of the book, 2 by Margaret Jackson and 1 by Lal Coveney, Leslie Key, and Pat Mahoney. And really what stood out for me in this book is how seamlessly the chapter flow chronologically and conceptually. And together they offer a compelling historical narrative of ideas surrounding women's liberation and the patriarchal backlash against feminism using sexuality as a tool of oppression. It's a book that's had a huge impact on me, on my feminism and on what I wrote afterwards. And I think it's very important. I know it's Sunday morning, but if you can hear it, it's a very important topic. So next slide. So Margaret Jackson, first chapter is called Sexology and the Social Construction of Male Sexuality. And it picks up historically where, Sheila, you left it. So the period of 1914 to 1939, and during which the rise of sexology, the new science of sex, coincides with a significant de-radicalization of the feminist movement. And so her key argument is that sexology played a central role in the backlash against the first wave of feminism. And she looks at how sexology influenced the social construction of sexuality to reinforce patriarchal control. So she understands sexuality not to be a reflection of the relation between men and women, but rather a fundamental of the construction of maintenance of male power, so what Sheila was discussing. And she questioned the social construction of sexuality, especially male sexuality, and as well as the concept of sexual pleasure and desire, especially female sexual pleasure. So the quote I put here is, I think, really telling. What is specific to the oppression of women of all race and class is that it takes a sexual form. Women constitute the only oppressed class which is dominated and controlled through sexuality, both directly by means of rape and other forms of overt sexual coercion, and indirectly by being taught to experience the sexual colonization of our bodies as sexual pleasure. So this is really what we're going to talk about next. So can I have the next slide, please? So Jackson highlights the sexual liberation has been confused for women's liberation. That's a very important point. And it comes from the uncritical assumption about sexual pleasure, and that sexual pleasure is universally seen as being a positive thing, and sexual practices are just a matter of personal choice, nothing political here. It is unquestioned, it is not political. However, she said that this perspective obscures violent practices, so for example, as pedophilia or sadomasochism, that can now be framed as sexual minorities that need to be protective against regressive forces. So the idea that it's uncritical leads to those kind of assumptions that, of course, are wrong. Jackson critiqued the ideology of sexual liberation, asserting that it is ultimately facilitating male sexual access to women and reinforcing male sexual control of women, and therefore it is not feminist, it is anti-feminist. She said that the implication of the ideology of sexual liberation are profoundly anti-feminist. The main reason for this lies in the failure to make problematic the concept of pleasure. Who defines it? Who has the power to ensure that certain definition prevails? And so unless we explore this and many other related questions, we may find ourselves in the position of asserting a right to something that is not in our interest as women. So can I have the next slide, please? Well, she looks at this question, especially who defines it. She naturally look into sexology, the so-called science of sex, and its prominent figures like Havelock Ellis. So Ellis is credited with establishing sexology as a science and influencing modern understanding of sexuality and sexual pleasure. One of the specifics of Ellis's work that raises Jackson's suspicion and a need to investigate his ideas and motive is that Ellis was particularly known to be a champion of women's right to sexual pleasure. He was asserting the rights of women on their behalf, erotic right of women on their behalf. And so most label him a progressive for recognizing the existence of female sexual pleasure, but also broadening the range of acceptable sexual behavior. She, on the contrary, maintains that he was, in fact, really anti-feminist. So, for example, he supported contraception and abortion, but opposed women working outside the home, arguing that women's brains were in their wombs and that our destiny was in motherhood. He labeled feminists like the punkers as conservative because they understood his agenda to not be in women's interest. Feminists of Ellis' time, as Sheila mentioned, were not in fact campaigning at all for equal right to sexual pleasure. They were looking for sexual autonomy for women. And many feminists viewed contraception and abortion as a way to give men more opportunity to demand sexual access to women and not necessarily in women's interests. So that's also very interesting in our perspective today. Feminists of Ellis's time, no, I've already said that. Feminists also campaigned for what was called equal moral standard for men and women, and the need to bring men's sexuality under control. Feminists understood the sexual violence not as an unfortunate result of men's nature. You know, men have urges and they can't help themselves. On the contrary, they understood it as a strategy to control women, and they demanded that men exercise control. So Ellis' ideology created a backlash against all these demands. Male sexual self-control was framed as unnatural, unhealthy, and worst of all, regressive, repressive, and feminist campaigns for sexual boundaries were dismissed as prudish. So because the feminist threat to patriarchy was severalfold, there was the rise of the spinsters, the rise of lesbianism, feminists demanding chastity from men. The sexologist approach was severalfold too. Ellis redefined any form of female resistance to heterosexuality as abnormal. So whether it was spinsterhood, women's aversion to heterosexual sex, or lesbianism, they were pathologized. But at the same time, he essentialized male sexuality as uncontrollable and inevitable. Because if male violent sexual behavior is seen as being in men's true nature, it's taken out of the political realm, it becomes unchangeable. And in fact, demanding to change it would be to act against nature itself. So can I have the next slide? So Jackson isolates two main themes in Ellis's work. First, Ellis maintained that normal heterosexual sex is based on power imbalance, which is biologically determined. He claimed that men are naturally born for sexual domination and that females are naturally born for sexual subordination. And this eroticized hierarchy is seen not only as inevitable, it is, in fact, essential to sexual pleasure. And secondly, the notion that all forms of abnormal sex are just extension of the normal. So even the most violent and dangerous form of sexual perversion is ultimately rooted in just innocent form of sexual impulse and are therefore implied to be harmless. Ellis explained that modesty, which is women's refusal to have sex with men, is a courtship game, and it is there to tease the man, and the modesty of the woman has to be conquered. And furthermore, women's favor need to be gained by surprise, not mutual agreement. So basically what Ellis is doing is just rape apology. And really whether a man has decided to, whatever a man has decided to do to a woman, it cannot be bad because it is in men's true nature to be dominant and violent. And it is in women's true nature to submit to it and to like it. And obviously, Ellis believed that pain and sexual pleasure were intimately linked, force being a necessary part of in courtship, and women's naturally loving being beaten, raped, and brutalized. I'm quoting here. Ellis sees pain as normal and essential as an essential part of sexual pleasure. So naturally, sadism and masochism are normalized, and they are just believed to be a slightly more extreme form of normal sex. In fact, if you look at the text, the only behavior that Ellis considered abnormal were women having any form of sexual boundaries at all. So can I have the next slide, please? So Ellis' concept of the art of love thought to train men to conquer, meaning here cure, women's aversion to sex and to teach women to experience submission as pleasure. He believed that in women averse to heterosexual sex, the pain element has failed to merge with the pleasure element. The task of the man becomes to overcome female resistance, to gain real possession of her soul and body through intercourse. And the ultimate aim is to train men to arouse their wife in order to stabilize marriage. So pain and pleasure are crucial elements into establishing that submission. Can I have the next slide, please? So into chapter 3, which also is by Margaret Jackson, it is a continuation of the first in the sense that she looks at sexologists that are influenced by Ellis, so the generation after 40s, 50s, 60s. And his impact was widespread from academia to the mainstream, particularly on a guy called Kinsley. Kinsley, whose work remains hugely important today. He founded the Institute for Sex Research, which has now become the Kingsley Institute and is still regarded as one of the world's leading center for sex research. So let's look at what they believe. So sexology presents itself as science and its finding regarded as facts. But Jackson highlights a contradiction because sex researchers claim their work is objective, but simultaneously they advance a sexually progressive agenda. They aim to alter societal understanding and practices around sexuality. And this is not neutral. And in this chapter, Jackson aims to disprove claims of neutrality, arguing that both Kinsley and Masters and Johnson, and in fact the whole field of sexology, is anti-feminist. And I am lost. And she suggests that the new scientific model is little more than a tool to legitimize male sexual behavior and male dominance of women. So continuing Ellis's work, Kinsley and Master and Johnson are described as anti-puritanical, opposing the sexual repression of what they call Victorian prudery, which is basically women's boundaries. Like Ellis, they claim to support women's liberation, but only so long as it aligned with male terms, which included a significant amount of heterosexual sex and women remaining in marriages, of course. And they criticize feminists for turning women against the naturalness of marriage and heterosexual coupling, maintaining an overall male-centered perspective. And this quote here, the fulfillment of the majority of women requires an enduring relationship with a man, by Masters and Johnson, is quite telling. And another contradiction that Jackson highlights is the assertion that heterosexuality is natural and that penetrative sex is the most natural form of sexual activity. And this, in sexology, persists despite the acknowledgement that women are more likely to experience orgasm from masturbation. A truly neutral approach would allow women to decide what sexual practice works best for them. And instead, sexologists warn that excessive masturbation in women could lead to an aversion to intercourse. And they also label masturbation as second best to intercourse. So second best for who, of course. It really reveals the penis-centered, very much non-neutral agenda that they had. In the sexologist's view, sex is conceptualized as necessary to life itself. There's dire consequences for those who don't have sex or who don't have enough sex. The penis in this framework is seen as indispensable for providing women with orgasms. So it is really an ideology because their findings suggest otherwise, and we know. And another contradiction is that while sexologists claim to separate sex from reproduction, they simultaneously regard sex as inherently reproductive. And she argues that this comes from male supremacist assumption of the primacy of the penis. And this contradiction is rooted in what she calls the concept she brings as coital imperative, which really is the collapse of the definition of sex to exclusively mean heterosexual penetrative sex. So can I have the next slide, please? So sexologist, essentialist or biological model of sexuality assumes each individual as an inherent sex drive. And this drive, according to the model, depends on internal factors like hormones, for example, but can also be triggered by external factors. And the drive accumulates, eventually demanding release. Men are generally assumed to have a stronger sex drive than women. And this model reinforces the idea that the male sex drive is uncontrollable. And if it's repressed, it could lead to mental illnesses or men committing sexual crimes. The drive is considered innate and therefore impossible to control or to suppress. Also, important point, while Kinsley spoke of women's sexual liberation, in fact, his primary concern was young men's lack of sexual outlet. So in other words, access to women to achieve orgasms. Much of his work focused on reform to increase legitimate sexual outlets for young unmarried men, incels. This sharply contrasts with feminist activism, as we've seen, who advocated for female sexual boundaries, the right to refuse sex in marriage, campaign against prostitution. So feminist demands pose a threat to Kinsley's vision of an inhibited male sexual expression. Kinsley, like Ellis, believed that male sexual aggression and female sexual submission were innate, biological facts, while Masters and Johnson adopted a slightly more modern view. They proposed a model in which both participants were active, but their work still revolved around heterosexuality as the norm. And overall, sexual violence against women and girls was trivialized very much in the same way that you've said, Sheila. I have similar examples. Women who were raped were said that to have provoked, wanted, or enjoyed the violence. And that really reflects Ellis's influence. And Kinsley's views on sexual abuse of girls by older men was especially disturbing. So he downplayed molestation, claiming that it was not as severe as rape. He argued that older men, being impotent, could not cause real harm to children. And he suggests that imprisoning such men was unfair. So not very feminist. And of course, sexual perversion were normalized. So Kinsley, like Ellis, saw them as part of a continuum and claimed that the difference between normal and abnormal sexuality is a matter of degree. Any cutoff point between them is therefore arbitrarily culturally determined. So there's no right and wrong here. It's just normal, and some are a bit more extreme than others. Many sexologists justified sexual perversion on the ground that many men engage in them. Therefore, they cannot be considered abnormal. And here there's this quote by this sexologist called Gebhardt, which is, I think, incredible. Sadomasochism is beautifully suited to symbolism. What better proof of power and status is there than inflicting pain and humiliation upon someone who does not retaliate? And what better proof of love is there than enduring or even seeking such treatment? So this is, in a nutshell, the BDSM ideology here in 1969. And it really doesn't strike me as feminist or neutral. In fact, this is the word of a man who has a personal inclination towards inflicting pain. And this is the word of a man with an agenda. So this is how BDSM, sadomasochism, became normalized and encouraged by sex therapists, by in contemporary sexual manual, contemporary at the time, but it's very, very true today when you see trauma and the link between trauma and BDSM being offered as a cure to trauma, for example, in the latest development. So Jackson challenges the idea that any sexual practices are acceptable so long as it involves consenting adult, because she questioned whether consent can truly exist in a structural power imbalance, a society like patriarchy. Yes, so can I have the next slide, please? So I love this quote. So these are this on slide. She really turned sexology's claim on their head, and she said there may be indeed no qualitative difference between normal and abnormal male sexuality, which is a point that several feminists have made as well. But what this suggests, however, is that male sexuality is itself a perversion in the sense that it is constructed as a tool for the exercise of male power. So can I have the next slide, please? So Jackson concludes that the entire sexology agenda is anti-feminist, a response to feminist challenge to male violence and control over women. Sexologists train women not only how to behave during sex, but also how to feel, indoctrinating them to accepting the coital imperative and enjoy being dominated in sex. So a couple of quotes. Freud, I know he was not a sexologist, but that fits so well. Intercourse is meant to overcome women's resistance and create a state of bondage. I encourage you to watch last week's Fem Perspective on Stockholm Syndrome for this, for example, where there was a little bit of that. Gebhardt, again, he talks about the interception of sadomasochism activity with, sorry, I'm going to start again. The interception of sadomasochist activity with loving and tenderness. This alternation makes the process more powerful. Now, if you were in any doubt that we're at war, police and brainwashers use the same technique of alternate brutality and sympathy to break their subjects. So both in these chapters, Jackson quotes, and she doesn't develop too much, the links between pain and pleasure, sadomasochism, what I see as Stockholm Syndrome, women's control, and yeah, BDSM. And I think it's a crucial part of the way men submit women during sex. And if that interests you further, I encourage you to read my chapter on spinning and weaving for a bit more detailed analysis. So then she concludes that sexual responses are constructed, not innate. I think it's quite clear. And we must reject the sexologist essentialist model, or we do not stand a chance to our own sexuality or liberation. So can I have the next slide, please? Yeah, and the next slide. Thank you. So the following chapter, and that's the last chapter, I know it's very dense, but there's so much to say, and it's fascinating. So that's the work of the collective Coveney, Key, and Mahoney. And their focus was on the early attempt at normalizing the swinging culture in the mainstream in the UK and the effect it had on women. So it's called Theory into Practice, because we're going to see the same themes, but in real life now. So they study the topic by looking at the content of Forum magazine, and they engage in a very thorough content analysis of the magazine from 68 to 81, so 165 issues. So Forum is Penthouse Forum, the British-American pornographic magazine. And so even if it's pornographic in nature, it was promoted as a sex education magazine, which is really why they looked into it. There's a lot of text, not just images. And ideologically, the authors stressed that Forum is an important link between racial and Freudian theories of sexual repression, the sexologist, and the growth of sex therapists. So based on the idea of the sexual liberation, they believe that sex is incretically a good thing, and promoted the idea that sexual repression is problematic. So we're really into the same ideological vein here. So it aims to promote the idea that sex is not dirty, and it was fighting the repressive idea about sex based on what they called centuries of ignorance, superstition, religious bigotry, and social taboos. But when we look at it, really, it's quite obvious that the people they blamed for finding sex dirty were women, and the reason for not liking sex was quite different from religious bigotry. In fact, what they opposed is the kind of sex that was imposed on them. So the ideology promoted by Forum is that there are no sexual perversion. All forms of sexual practices are good, and no practice should be off limits. And I'm going to quote here, that means, no limit to fetishist, masochist, sadist, pederast, invert, necrophilist, exhibitionist, coprophilist, travestist. I mean, there's some that I didn't even know what it meant. I had to have a look at it. It's Sunday morning, so I'm going to spare you. So it's all fine, and it's all harmless fun. The aim was to get women to comply with these sexual practices that they found disgusting, grooming them to get rid of their sexual repression, which are an unfortunate obstruction to male sexual pleasure. And the whole thing really read like a massive guilt trip exercise and grooming to get women to become liberated and enlightened, which really is male speech for compliant to male sexual demands. So can I have the next slide, please? So, for example, women are encouraged to join their husbands into what they call sexual adventures, even when it gives them no pleasure at all. The sexual happiness of the man is crucial. An unhappy man means an unhappy marriage. And so it is the woman's responsibility to see to that happiness. And there is no mention of her happiness or needs. In fact, her sexual unwillingness is what caused his impotence. On the contrary, what we are told is that she must comply to whatever he wants because, and I quote here, little can go wrong between married partner if it leads to the increased happiness of one and so inevitably of both, and does no harm to either. So I'm quoting this because I'm now going to show you an example of what they quote as harmless sexual adventure. So for example, there was a man fantasizing himself to be a horse. There was, of course, plenty of women forced or coerced to accept the man extramarital affairs, watching pornography before or during sex, joining sex group sessions, and a very elaborate and particularly sadistic session where a man enforces a rubber outfit, rope bondage, sensory restriction, torture, punishment, and whipping to his wife. And so in that case, his sexual happiness comes from her being tortured. So harmless fun for who? Happiness for who? Women are encouraged to have sex with other partners also, and to accept to engage in group sex of swinging. And the advantage of this for the man are obvious. He gets to have multiple sexual partners without being caught cheating. And also swinging breaks down women's inhibitions and teaches to separate sex from emotion, which we've seen is what liberated sexuality is all about. And he derives a satisfaction to see his wife accepting things that she doesn't want to do, but does only to please him out of love. There is a real sense of control and power that he derives from this dynamic. So women are made to feel doubly guilty. They have to share this adventure out of marital duty, even when they don't want to and they don't want to. And they cannot react with being upset or jealous, because that wouldn't be liberated. And over we see this word liberated used against women to make them partake in activities and practices that they reject. And so Forum wants women to develop their self-sex realization. This is encouraged, but only, of course, on men's terms. And it has to happen in a way that doesn't threaten him and his ego. So they seem to have been very, very nervous at Forum about women's sexual potential. There's a real fear of women's ability to orgasm multiple times, for example, and that, we are told, may make men impotent. There seem to be quite a lot of things that may make men impotent. And so much fear, in fact, that women are called multi-orgasmic monsters for this. There's a little story about a man being threatened by his wife's vibrator. I found quite entertaining. And it really shows men's inability and unwillingness to connect to women, including sexually, but also their fear of not being able to satisfy a woman. So women's sexual self-expression threatens men's confidence. It is women who need to adjust, or they are called monsters. And of course, men are never expected to change their sexual practice to adjust to women's preferences, obviously. And husbands in the Forum are husbands of unwilling women are encouraged to, and I quote, and this is not very pleasant, exploit situation in which she has no option but to cooperate. So, for example, chasing her, stripping her, smacking her bottom, tying her up, raping her are all examples of situation in which she is manifestly in your power, and she cannot therefore be expected to avoid sex. And it's all justified thanks to sexology, because remember, your wife is, like everyone else, a sex maniac. All she wants is an excuse. So he's helping her, really, is giving her an excuse. In Forum view, it is not men who are responsible for raping their daughters. It is daughters who provoke their fathers. It is wives who are starving their husband and sexually, and therefore responsible for the rape to happen. Women are expected to accept violent acts done to them, including altering their bodies surgically to facilitate men orgasms. And to achieve this, women are made to feel inadequate or physically abused and beaten. So I'm going to stop here for the content text, and I'm just going to conclude that Jackson explained that Ellis provided a pseudoscientific foundation for patriarchal construct of sexuality, which influenced many sexologists after him. Ellis and other sexologists discredited feminists as prudish and spinsters as failure for rejecting the joys of heterosexuality. And this strategy remains a tool for undermining feminist activism today. And I mean, which one of us hasn't been called a prude for our activism? Jackson concludes that sexology served as a key weapon in the patriarchal backlash, reinforcing male power while delegitimizing feminist demand for sexual autonomy. And it was an essential tool for the maintenance of patriarchy. In the last chapter, it really demonstrates Margaret Jackson's point. The author concludes that sexual liberation is a shortcut for men's sexual liberation or sexual pleasure, and that can only happen at the expense of women. So sexual liberation, direct application, and its consequences is devastating for women's lives and for women's liberation. The sexual liberation ideology of the sexologists have taken women from being spinsters, free from all uninvited touch of men, to willing sex slave, guilt-tripped and trained to please men. And the collective work of this book also demonstrates that heterosexuality, its ideology, its propaganda, its practice is socially constructed, not innate. And if you want proof that no woman is born to be sexually submissive, the whole new science had to be created, and a whole century of relentless propaganda was necessary to train them into it. So I want to finish by something a little bit more positive. A powerful plea, and like Dworkin before her, she incites women to sexual resistance against our colonization. And she said, can I have the next slide, because the quote is in there, please. For feminists, the crucial question would seem to be, how are our fantasies and desire constructed Whose interests do they serve? How can we at the same time accept them instead of guiltily suppressing them, and transcend them rather than indulge in them, celebrate them? In other words, we must challenge the assertion that the association between sex and power are inevitable, and the dominance and submission are inherent sexual activities and essential to sexual pleasure, whether in lesbian or heterosexual relationships.
So just hand over to Sheila just to say a final word.
Yes, I don't think I have very much more to say, except that I'm very pleased that Angela and Liz decided to do this book and bring her back from the grave, as it were. It was republished more recently than 1984, not 1884. So thanks. You've got the original. Thanks very much for doing it. I'm very pleased. It's great that you found it useful, and it's great that you covered it. Really, I think that's all I want to say. Angela, anything else you want to say?
Other than women, encouraging women to read the book and to go into these difficult topics. I know they are personal and sometimes they are difficult, but they are absolutely essential if we want liberation. So please.